In April of 1912, the largest ship in the world began its maiden voyage. She was fitted with the finest luxuries in the world, carried the minimum requirement of lifeboats, and had enough watertight compartments and safety features to be considered practically unsinkable. But on a cold April night, it struck an iceberg and vanished beneath the seas. Everyone knows this description to be of the Titanic. However, what you may not know is that 14 years before the Titanic disaster, a struggling author by the name of Morgan Robertson wrote a book titled Futility. It concerns a ship that was the largest in the world. It was fitted with the finest luxuries available, carried the minimum requirement of lifeboats, and had enough watertight compartments and safety features to be considered practically unsinkable. But on a cold April night, it struck an iceberg and vanished beneath the seas. This fictional ship was called the Titan. Now, there's a chance you might have heard this story before. The basic idea that author Morgan Robertson predicted the Titanic disaster has been recounted time and time again. It's been told in books, documentaries, films, video games, and more. It's virtually become folklore at this point, in a similar vein to other legends. But how similar is the fictional Titan compared to the real-life Titanic? Can these similarities be explained? And can the book be called an absolute foretelling or an interesting coincidence? But before we discuss this further, we should give context on both the author and the book. First, we'll discuss the author. Morgan Robertson was born on March 30th, 1861. At a young age, Robertson followed in the footsteps of his father and became a sailor on the Great Lakes. Eventually, Robertson left the service to work as a jeweler. When his eyesight began to decline, he took to writing stories. He typically wrote about adventure on the high seas, and even wrote some science fiction. Despite it being his main income, he never found much financial success. He died on March 24th, 1915, in Atlantic City. Now, let's discuss the book itself. Despite popular media proclaiming it as the story of the Titanic, the actual book is not about the fictional Titanic. The book is about the redemption of a down-on-his-luck sailor named John Rowland, who is a sailor on the Titan. While on board, Rowland comes across an estranged former lover and her daughter. When the ship sinks, Rowland rescues the daughter by jumping onto the iceberg. Eventually, they are rescued by a passing ship and are brought back to England to give testimony. This story doesn't really involve the Titanic all that much. Only the first third actually concerns the Titan. It's not even that long of a book. It's only 70 pages. But now that you know a little bit more about the author and the book, we can continue with the similarities. The first similarity to mention is the basic description. Both ships are of English origin. The Titan is 800 feet long and has 4 funnels. The Titanic is 892 feet long and has 4 funnels. Seems prophetic. However, if one does research, they could actually find out what was probably the real-world inspiration for the fictional Titan. The SS Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse. Built by the Germans and launched a year prior, the Kaiser was the largest ship in the world at the time of its construction.
Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse was the largest ship at the time of the first publication of Futility. And she was somewhere around 655 feet, if I remember, and then Titan is 800. So what Robertson really wanted with the story of the Titan was he wanted this to be a behemoth. He wanted it to be far bigger than any other ship conceivable at the time. So he did that sort of jump up from the Kaiser. But she was very similar with the 4 funnels and being so grand.
The Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse was German-built And with Imperial Germany being the top rival of England during this time period, it's only natural to assume that the British would respond. And they did. England's Cunard Line introduced their own two four-funneled ocean liners that were even larger than the Kaiser. These ships were the Mauretania and the Lusitania. Ironically, the White Star Line, Cunard Line's chief rival, would respond with their own four-funneled ocean liners, the Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. The Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse not only most likely inspired the fictional Titan, but its construction also inadvertently led to the creation of the real-life Titanic. Continuing on with the description of the ship, if we look at the interior, one could see that Robertson must have also took inspiration from another famous ocean liner, the Great Eastern, which was the largest ship ever built at the time of its 1859 maiden voyage.
And really, Great Eastern is the most similar ship to Titan that I can think of. It was a very similar length, at least compared to other ships. It had a lot of this technology. It had all of this over-the-top fanfare to a voyage.
Then there's the matter of the lifeboats. In Robertson's description, the Titan only had enough lifeboats to satisfy the law. It had only 24 lifeboats, which, if you look back at the maritime laws at the time, you'd find that it would actually have more lifeboats than required. In 1898, the minimum requirement of lifeboats for a ship that weighed more than 10,000 tons was 16. By contrast, Titanic had 16 lifeboats, plus an additional 4 collapsible lifeboats. Evidently, Robertson got the law wrong. However, the fact that both ships didn't have enough lifeboats for everyone really isn't as shocking as you might think. It was actually very common.
The fact that it only satisfied the law is not a coincidence. Every ship only satisfied the law. Titanic is just the one that got caught.
Perhaps Robertson was making commentary on the lack of lifeboats required for safety. In that case, he wasn't the first. Others at that time made similar concerns. In 1886, newspaper editor William T. Stead wrote a short story titled How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor. It was about a ship that sank in the North Atlantic, in which the majority of its occupants perished due to the lack of lifeboats. What makes Stead's story striking is that in 1912, Stead found himself aboard the RMS Titanic on its maiden voyage. He was so concerned by the lack of lifeboats that he predicted the very way he was going to die. Both ships were also called practically unsinkable. And while today we look at that and think, that's a pretty big similarity, the truth of the matter is, the idea that the Titanic was unsinkable has been embellished by popular media.
It was a term that they used on practically everything. Practically everything was practically unsinkable. Great Eastern was called unsinkable in 1859. Lusitania was called unsinkable. Olympic was called unsinkable. Every ship was unsinkable. And then when the ship didn't sink, oh look, they were right. So being called that, he added irony to it, because I don't think they called Great Lakes ships practically unsinkable. I guess they were a little bit more realistic out there.
Which brings me to the big similarity between the Titan and the Titanic that is probably most discussed. The fact that they both sink after striking an iceberg. However, the manner in which they both sink is a little different from each other. Both hit an iceberg on an April night, but where they differ is that when the Titan sank, it went down within minutes, leaving little chance for any of its lifeboats to depart. The Titanic took 2.5 hours to sink and managed to launch most of its lifeboats. When people discuss the book, they make it seem as though it's a full foretelling of the Titanic disaster. But they aren't exactly one-to-one. In fact, there's quite a few supposed similarities that people like to bring up that are not present in the original story. It's not uncommon to hear that the Titan was on its maiden voyage, just like the Titanic, when in fact, it was not. It was traveling on its fifth return voyage. Even the back of my copy of the book says that it was on its maiden voyage. And here's another thing. The Titanic was traveling from Southampton to New York. The Titan was traveling from New York to Southampton. With all this said, there are still plenty of similarities between the two ships that aren't as explainable. They both hit an iceberg in the Atlantic. They both sank in April. Their survivors were picked up by a ship that was bound for the Mediterranean. And finally, they both had similar names. All these similarities are worthy of mention, but do they make the book a true prediction?
Are very striking and certainly worth raising an eyebrow to. But there's quite a bit of differences too. And we can see where he got most of this from. It's a fun coincidence, but I don't think it's anything more than that.
In my opinion, Morgan Robertson most likely did not intentionally predict the Titanic disaster. While the book's content is remarkable, much of it can be explained away through the events that were going on in the shipping industry and the greater world at that time. In fact, quite a bit of other stories of people who have predicted the future can be explained away with similar logic. So, case closed. However, there might be a cog in this line of thinking. A year before Morgan Robertson died, he wrote a story titled Beyond the Spectrum. It was set in the future and was about a war between the United States of America and the Empire of Japan. This fictional war began when Japanese forces surprise attacked US forces stationed in Hawaii and ended when the United States of America used a new superweapon on Japan. With this in mind, perhaps it might be reasonable to say that there are such things as fortune tellers.